The following program is made possible with support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation.
Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Heather Berlin.
And I'm Faith Saley. Science Goes to the Movies is all about movies, TV shows, pop culture, and science.
Today we're going to look at the economics of the Hunger Games.
We all have one enemy. And that's President Snow. He corrupts everyone and everything. He turns the best of us against each other. Stop killing for him. Tonight, turn your weapons to the Capitol. Turn your weapons to Snow.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 76th Hunger Games.
We're delighted to be joined today by Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. From 2009 to 2011, Bernstein was the chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joseph Biden. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Are you a Hunger Games fan?
Yeah, very much so.
You are?
Yeah.
You've seen the series? You've read
I've
the
seen
books?
the series. I also have teenage daughters,
Oh,
so
yes.
I actually read the books along with them, and I saw the movies, and didn't like all of them the same as much. I think the quality maybe went down a little bit along the way, but good stuff. And I'm a huge Jennifer Lawrence fan, so there's that.
So, how close are we to Pan Am?
I don't think we're particularly close to Pan Am. Pan Am is what an economist would call an extractive economy. That is an economy run by a very tightly controlled political elite that extracts massive resources from the districts in the case of the Hunger Games. Our economy is modeled more on what the economists call an inclusive basis. So you have an extractive economy and an inclusive economy. Ours is less extractive and more inclusive. That said, though, there are ways in which our economy, I believe, is becoming less inclusive, mostly through the growth of inequality. And for particular groups in our economy, I mean, they're downright excluded. So I think there are interesting wrinkles in there, but we're not nearly as bad as Pan Am.
Indeed, here in America, we're struggling with income inequality. In Pan Am, income inequality is played out to an extreme degree. And one of the key political tools of Pan Am is the Hunger Games, literally pitting poor people against each other. Are we doing that same thing here in America in a way?
There are ways in which we sometimes do. I think in politics, pit poor people against each other. One thing we do, and it's not so easy to see, is we often prevent people through forming more coalitions where they can do collective bargaining. So unions used to be a really important way in which people could sort of fight back if they didn't have very much bargaining power. And there's not that much there anymore. There's one way in which I worry that we're really starting to pit low-income people against each other, and that's in the immigration debate. I think it's really becoming clear that a strategy of certain politics and politicians is to pit one group of low-income people against another group of low-income people, where that second group comes from another country.
But that's not new, right?
That's not new at all. You're exactly right. I shouldn't intimate that that somehow is new. However, it does seem to be resurfacing. It kind of goes up and down.
Yeah.
And I see that resurfacing such that there are politicians trying to explain to people that your problem is not because of, Pan Am or the Capitol, if you want to think of it in Hunger Games terms. Your problem is because of that guy over there who's taking your job. And that is a very, I think, typical and devious kind of approach.
And in the Hunger Games, the beginning of the end of President Snow happens when Katniss befriends this little girl, Rue, from District 3, I think it is, yeah. And much of the rest of the story is about the growing solidarity among the districts. So does that have parallels in the American labor movement?
Well, I think it does, but let me just reflect a little bit on your insight, because I really very much like it. What happened in the Hunger Games that was kind of inspiring, I think, for a lot of people who saw the movie, read the books, was precisely what you just described. The capital can only function if these districts remain balkanized, completely separate from each other. And in fact, they're supposed to go into that pit and kill each other. The minute they start working together, the system is threatened. And that does very much parallel kind of the thinking of the American labor movement, the idea that the little guy and gal have just no bargaining clout on their own. The only way they're going to be able to kind of fight back and secure for themselves a fair wage, or as an economist would view it, their fair share of the productivity growth, is by collectively bargaining.
In Panem, or in America, is a growing underclass, does that create instability?
I think it really does create instability, and I think we can see some of that now in the sense that our politics, for example, seem to be pretty all over the map. It's really hard to figure out where the electorate is going. Certainly there's tremendous gridlock. I work in Washington, D.C., so believe me, that's dysfunction junction, and it's very much a story of instability. It's extremely difficult for an advanced economy that's worth $18 trillion, that's our GDP, to function without a functioning federal government. One of the sources of this instability is this inequality problem we talked about before. Because if people feel that the game is rigged against them, is the way certain politicians put it these days, if people feel that they're doing what they're supposed to, they're playing by the rules, they're working maybe full time, they're aspiring to higher education for their children, maybe they're saving, and yet they're not able to get ahead, year after year, that creates, I think, not just the kind of class that's left behind, as you described, but resentment and instability.
I mean, some even argue that the terrorism and the rest of it is bred because of this dissatisfaction with their life circumstances, with no matter what else they do, they can't get ahead, and some people turn to things like terrorism. And some people have made that argument.
Well, let me just say, I don't know about that. What I do know is the following, and this is some economic history that is extremely relevant in my view. If you look at the wages or income of the median household, the household right in the middle of the scale, 50th percentile, for decades, say between the 40s and the mid-70s, they tracked growth. They tracked productivity. Growth doubled, the economy's productivity doubled, their living standards doubled. Since then, productivity or economic growth is up about 75% and their income is up about 9%. That gap kind of tells you all you need to know about that inequality story.
Jared, would you say that the Hunger Games could be thought of as a cautionary tale for America?
I very much do. I very much do. In fact, one of the reasons I've asked myself, why are my children reading these dystopias like the Hunger Games? And why is this kind of story so resonant right now? And I think it may very well have to do with a very exaggerated version, a kind of hyperbolic version of what we're talking about.
Let's talk about some of the economic concepts that apply to the Hunger Games. So what exactly is a pyramid economy?
A pyramid economy is an economy that's controlled by a very narrow slice there right at the top of the pyramid. So again, you have elites that collect a disproportionate share of the resources, where the vast majority of the population in the lower parts of the pyramid gets a lot less.
Is there any way to sort of rectify this situation?
Rectifying the situation is harder than you think. It can be done, but it was very interesting that at the end of the Hunger Games, you don't find that everything's all better, that somehow the pyramid has become much more equal. What you find is that the top has been kind of decapitated, right? That's the end of the story. It can be changed, but it takes a long time because the institutions needed to change that, particularly a robust democracy, take a while to evolve. And if I may just get into foreign policy for a quick second, I think one of the mistakes that we made when we went into Iraq is that we just assumed that if we could get rid of that sort of top of the pyramid for them, that the door would fly open and everyone would want to participate in democracy, to be little d Democrats. And, of course, that didn't happen. And it's a great lesson, much like the lesson from Pan Am, that these institutions needed for democracy to flourish take a while to mature and evolve.
But you're saying, in a sense, democracy is the solution to this. However, in America, we've, what you said is like a pyramid economy, which we've been in a democracy for many years now, yet we haven't managed to get out of this sort of pyramid scheme, so to speak. So,
well, this gets you right back to the cautionary tale. Earlier in our discussion, I said America's not like Pan Am, and it's not. We're much more inclusive than extractive, but we're moving in that direction, in the Pan Am direction, in the pyramid direction, in ways that are very disconcerting to me. And one of the problems that we're facing, and it's an existential problem in this country, is that as wealth concentrates at the top of the pyramid, and there's so much money in politics, what you have there is the very top of the pyramid buying the politicians and the policies they want to really make that kind of pyramid stay.
Self-perpetuating.
It's self-perpetuating. That does really keep me up at night.
And the people who have the most vested interests are the people who have the most investments.
That's right. And if they have the most vested interest. And notice one of the things that you see them beginning to do. They're looking at ways that might make it harder to make people vote. You see, that strikes right at the heart of democracy. The idea is if you're sitting at the top of the pyramid and you're kind of owning the politics and the process, one of the things you want to kind of keep the people in their districts, to put it in the Hunger Game terms. The problem is not just the concentration of wealth at the top of the pyramid. That's a big part of the problem. It's the ability of that elite at the very top to protect themselves.
In the Hunger Games, the outlying districts of Pan Am are barred from trading with each other.
Right.
And labor is barred from moving either between districts or into other jobs. In other words, in Pan Am, if you're born a coal miner, you die a coal miner.
Right.
that's definitely bad for a person, but is it also bad for the economy?
It's terrible for the economy. You can easily imagine someone born in Katniss's district, District 12, who had to go down the coal mines, who would have been a critically important innovator.
Steve Jobs is
Yeah, right.
born in District 12, right?
Exactly. If Steve
And he's going to grow up to be a coal miner regardless of his talents and inspiration. So the Pan Am economy can never benefit from what Steve Jobs would ever give.
So to put it in annoying economese terms, labor mobility is essential. Labor has to be able to go where they want to pursue the kinds
Leapfrog.
of opportunities that are there. And by the way, very interesting thing in the Hunger Games, at least in the book, I'm not sure if it made it into the movies. So Prim is in District 13 in the last book, and she starts showing some signs of being useful in medical treatment. And she tells Katniss, this is Katniss' little sister, she tells Katniss that, they've decided to train me to be a doctor. And there's just this little sentence that says, that never would have happened in District 12. And I thought, very, very important point.
By the way, interesting footnote, Steve Jobs is the biological son of a Muslim immigrant from Syria who was raised by Paul and Clara Jobs.
Well, to be clear, it's not just the Steve Jobses who might be sitting in Syria. There are disadvantaged people in neighborhoods who, by dint of their skin color and where they were born, face the same problem. Malcolm X, in his book, he talked about a numbers runner in Harlem. So this is like a bookie. And this guy remembered all the numbers in his head, and he did all this arithmetic and math in his head. And Malcolm X said if he had been born, a white guy downtown, he'd be making a killing on Wall Street. And that really stuck with me. I think it's germane.
In Pan Am, the capital has everything. In Katniss's home, District 12, there's almost no electricity and very little technology. But the capital's got this high-tech, high-speed train, and the Hunger Games themselves are full of extraordinary technological advances, which leads us to our next economic concept.
Economists theorize that long-term prosperity is driven by the accumulation of capital or money, plus something called the Solow residual, named for economist Robert Solow. So what's the Solow residual?
I can explain that.
You probably know this guy, right?
I do. I know Bob Solow. Yeah, brilliant economist. I saw him the other day. He's 90 years old and he's still way smarter than anybody else. So he's amazing. So here's the Solow residual. Imagine that an economy creates $1,000 worth of output using whatever inputs it has, labor inputs, machinery, technology, okay? Creates $1,000 this year, just to keep the math simple. Next year, with precisely the same inputs, the same labor, the same capital, the same land, it creates $1,100 worth of output. That's a 10% increase. Where did that come from? It didn't come from more work, because we're holding that constant. It didn't come from more machinery. It came from something else. It came from some kind of innovation. And it's a residual. We can't figure out exactly what it was, but we know it wasn't all of those inputs. And that's the solo residual. And it basically means something happened in terms of our technology, our innovation, that we were able to increase our output by 10% without any new inputs. We must have been using technology differently. We must have been interacting in some more productive way.
I mean, is it an X factor? Is it efficiency? Is it is it confidence?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, a residual is by definition a leftover. So we label it technology and innovation. We don't really know what it is. So
it's kind of like the fudge factor.
It's the fudge factor, yeah.
Okay, spoiler alert for anyone who has not seen or read the ending of the Hunger Games trilogy. I'm about to talk about the ending of the Hunger Games. After all of Katniss's hardship, loss, and suffering, in the end, she only manages to decapitate the Capitol's hold on the district. She gets rid of Snow and replaces him with Coin, who is brilliantly played by Julianne Moore, but just as evil. Jared, we see this change of one bad leader for another all the time. So when a country overthrows an authoritarian, exploitative leader, and which they do so often, and then replace them with another exploitative or authoritarian leader, why does that happen?
I actually think there's a pretty straightforward answer to that. It happens because the institutions of democracy have not had a chance to grow and flourish in that place. It happens because what I was calling an extractive economy, where a narrow political elite extracts resources from the rest of the society, is still in place. All you've done is change one a figurehead for another.
Let's go to the Hunger Games, right? How hard would it be for Panem to get to be a democracy?
Very hard. Panem is an extractive economy, and as you suggested, at the end of this story, there's kind of a different extractor at the top from President Snow. What has to happen in Panem is not just for the rebels to come together and decapitate the leader, but for the rebels to come together and to begin to insist on a level of inclusion, we call it democracy, that they hadn't had there for probably something like 70 years, as I understand the history. One other thing, it's certainly the case that we have an evolved democracy and the kinds of inclusive institutions that I've described. But it's also true that our incredibly high levels of wealth and income concentration are a threat to that. And they're a threat to that not just because a few people have a lot of the money. They're a threat to that because of what they can do with it. And the fact that they can influence the politics to build a more extractive pyramid sort of shape, Panem-like economy. We can't let that happen.
I have a question about the excessive demonstration of wealth that you see in Panem, in the capital.
Yeah.
It's outre, right? Their hair, and the amount of food that they eat. Does that act like a tool in this kind of extractive economy? How does that work? Is it some kind of like a psychological tool to flaunt such excess?
I think it is a tool like that, and it reminds me of some of the ways they've used propaganda as well in the story. The elites, in order to really cement their position, have to not only extract from all of the districts the way they do, but they have to show the people around them that that extraction is worth it to them. And they do that by living these incredible lives of wealth that you see in the Capitol. And frankly, if you've ever gone to Aspen, Colorado and looked at the airplanes on the runway, you get a little bit of the same flavor.
The other question is, the elites, why would they want to give up what they have? Why would they fundamentally in their nature feel giving? And I don't know how we can really change that fundamental human characteristic.
That's a very important point. I mean, in that sense, Coin wasn't all that different from Snow, right? The person who sits right at the top of that little bit of the pyramid there, if that person and their power structure that enforces their control wants to continue extracting, and they typically do because it's kind of nice for them. What is it Mel Brooks said? It's good to be king. It's hard to stop that.
Another important economic concept affecting both America and Pan Am is the broken window fallacy, also known as the glazier's fallacy. Jared, can you tell us how that applies to the Hunger Games?
So the broken window fallacy is the idea that if a window breaks in the town, that's a good thing, because somebody has to replace the window, and that means work for the glazier. They used to call it the glazier fallacy, I guess a glazier.
The window guy.
It's a window guy. And so the idea would be, well, we should just go around breaking windows because that's going to create more business. But in fact, the reason it's a fallacy is because all you're doing is taking some of your money, your resources, to replace something that was okay in the first place, a window that wasn't broken, when you could have used that money for something that would have made your society better off. I mean, the Hunger Games itself is in some ways analogous to a broken window fallacy, because the idea is that if the Capitol just keeps people essentially killing their children, which is, really a crazy thing to think about, then somehow the society will move ahead through the kinds of control that the Capitol metes out on the districts. And of course, as you see in the evolution of the book, it is shown to be a fallacy.
So basically, the sum point would be that violence is not an economic additive.
Yes, that's very much so. And in fact, it's quite relevant because we spend a lot of money on defense and on war. And there's something called military Keynesianism in economics. And that means one of the ways you can grow your economy is through spending on the military. I mean, that does create some growth. And in some cases, that kind of stimulus, it's really a Keynesian stimulus, can be useful. But if you do too much of that, it means that you're not doing enough of something else. And that, in economics, the concept is opportunity cost. It's actually one of the economic concepts that I think is really important. And that's the idea that if I'm using my dollar to do this, I can't use that same dollar to do that. And sure, there's going to be some amount of military and defense spending that's critical for economies in a world like ours. But there is such a thing as too much. That means you're underinvesting in something else that could be a lot more pro-growth. That's important because there are economists who will tell you, they're wrong, but they'll tell you all day that if you pursue more of those kinds of social democratic policies, that you're going to kill the golden goose of growth. That is, if you give longer maternity leave, or if you use more of your resources for, say, free college or something like that, or health care that's more accessible to people, that somehow that's going to kill growth. That's proved to be false time and again, but it's a very effective kind of meme that some of these folks will tell you about.
Doesn't it seem in the first 2/3 of the Hunger Games that things are great for everyone in the Capitol, but in the last movie, when we finally get to the Capitol, we discover it kind of sucks to live in the Capitol too. Like, life just kind of sucks for everyone in Pan Am. Everyone is a little bit frightened, except for President Snow. The closest comparison I can make in real life to that would be what it was like to live under Stalin. Pan Am and Soviet Russia were both command economies. So, what is a command economy, and what are the alternatives?
So in a command economy, instead of allowing what we call free markets to make the decisions about what to produce and how much to produce and how to produce it, those commands come from on high. And they say, we will have this many bushels of wheat, and they will be constructed in these factories by these methods. And since economies work much better when they can innovate, we had that discussion about the Solow residual earlier, where they can innovate and find more efficient ways of doing things, command economies tend to get that deeply wrong at great cost.
So there's it's sort of a top-down economy or a bottom-up, where people, the idea is that you have faith that there'll be this natural evolution and people will naturally sort of evolve the economy in the right direction from the bottom up, rather than there being the top-down.
Yeah, I think the thing is that the way the world and the economy really works, especially our economy, is much more gray than black and white. It's not command, of course, but it's not pure free market by a long shot. If you look at our tax code, we subsidize all kinds of different activities. We steer the market this way and that. We have lots of ways in which we regulate the market, important ways, so that, for example, polluters don't harm the rest of us. And so there is no pure free market. There, unfortunately, have been some pure command economies, and they've worked badly.
The concept of a fair and equal economy is that a fictional utopia? Is there always something going to be a little bit sort of out of balance or a little bit unfair?
I think the answer is generally yes. It's hard to imagine an economy where everybody has the same amount of stuff, for example. I think what you want to aspire to is something more like a meritocracy, where you're able to go as far as your intellect and your initiative will take you. And I think while sometimes people say we have that here, we don't. I think the problem that we face here is that there are a lot of meritorious people who never get ahead, and there are a lot of people who are born on third but think they hit a triple. And therein lies one of the problems.
I have never heard that phrase. That's brilliant.
It's true.
We love a good sports metaphor here at Science Goes to the Movies.
Yeah, I've got about 2 of them, so I've heard 50% of my sports metaphors.
Jared, you are a political economist and have answered all our questions in a fascinating way. And it also seems like you are genuinely enthusiastic about these movies, genuinely interested. Is there something else you'd like to add that you take away from your experience?
Well, I mean, just personally, one of the reasons I enjoyed this so much was because I was able to share it with my children. And they love these books. I have daughters who are 16 and 14, and so they read them a few years back. But they love these books, and we could talk about them. Some of these conversations we had today, I had with them, though their attention spans aren't as long as yours.
Well, thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you.
It's been great having you
My
here.
pleasure.
And don't forget to check us out on the web at CUNY.tv under the Science tab, where you'll find past shows, additional content, and a link to our app.